Hello, my name is Renata Suma. I am a PhD candidate of the Institute of International Relations of PUC-Rio. Continuing the HASOW series of interviews, today I talk with Steve Vigil, who works on El Salvador. Hi.
Hello.
How is violence constituted in El Salvador? What are its main expressions in this scenario, and what are the main differences between the forms of violence identified in these settings and the ones identified in war contexts?
First of all, let me just explain a bit about the work I do so that it's clear for the folks watching. I'm the co-chair of a grassroots coalition called the Transnational Advisory Group in support of the peace process in El Salvador. It's a bit of an unwieldy name. We go by TAGSPPES. And it's made up of organizers and violence prevention specialists from the United States who've worked in the Salvadoran diaspora. We came together to support the gang truce that has started in El Salvador in March of last year. So when we're looking at violence in El Salvador, I think it's important to look at the issue of what's happened with the truce in the last year. That said, I'll speak a little bit about what's the trends on violence in El Salvador that have led up to the situation that we have there right now. The common narrative when people talk about El Salvador is the issue of the gangs and this transnational aspect of these gangs that have spread from Los Angeles, from the United States through deportations and spread throughout Central America. And a lot of the violence is attributed to them. I think it's important that when we're talking about the violence in El Salvador, we also look at the issue that El Salvador itself has a history of violence dating back to the early part of the last century. And a lot of that violence had to do with issues of confrontation between the citizenry and the state. There's a history of massacres that go back to the 1930s, and then in the 1980s we had the Civil War. In 1992 we had the peace accords that ended the Civil War, and at about that time we also had a situation where in Los Angeles there were riots that took place, and California began to deport criminal aliens. So you had young men arriving in El Salvador, which was the country of their birth, but many of them who hadn't been there since they were children, who had become gang affiliated or become affiliated with two of the major gangs in Los Angeles during their time in the States, and then arriving in an El Salvador that was rapidly changing due to the peace accords and the coming of peace. This somewhat coincided with the peace accords and what I've termed an incomplete peace process having to do with the war itself and the reconciliation process that did not happen between the conflicting parties there. The gangs arrived. At first nobody really realized who they were. It could be akin to they were looked at as somewhat of the cool kids who had arrived from California. There was more of a trend. I think people looked at more of a style without recognizing that these young men who had been deported, they brought the gang wars and the gang styles that they had learned in Los Angeles to the streets of El Salvador. What's important to note about that is, at the end of the war, there were certain things that were not necessarily completely accomplished in terms of addressing some of the root causes of the violence in El Salvador and what led to the war in the first place. So you had a large pool of young people who had lack of opportunity, a lot of things that when you're looking at a post-conflict situation, but had not had many of these issues addressed. Coupled with the fact that there was extreme violence during the war, there was of a very different nature that took place in Los Angeles. And I think that's important to note, because a lot of times people look at the violence in Central America and attribute it to the gangs themselves, and that this is violence that came with the gangs. And in speaking with the gang members themselves, they will tell you, look, the gang style and the way we play in terms of the gangs, yes, that came from Los Angeles. But the violence itself is very much a homegrown product. And that's something I think that gets left out of the narrative quite a bit. And not only is it's not just the gang violence that takes place. I think that's the most common element, because you've got this young group of people with tattoos, and they're very easily distinguished from the rest of society. But that doesn't mean that all the violence is attributed to them. There's discussion that El Salvador would be a violent place whether the gangs were there or not. And people we went there, our group went there for a delegation, met with the Minister of Justice, some government officials, we met with NGOs, we met with the prison leadership themselves, and across the board people said there are other criminal elements that are taking advantage of the violence themselves for their own activities. And then on top of that, you have just the history of there's a lot of interpersonal violence that takes place in different forms, high rates of femicide. We've seen that with the truce, there's been a reduction in the number of homicides. El Salvador went from being the #2 most violent place in the world. I don't know what the ranking is now, but the homicide rate basically halved. But rates of violence against women are still high. So you do have this, it's not easy to pinpoint one particular context for the violence. I mean, it's across the board, and I think a lot of it does have to do with looking at the fact that the trauma that this society has gone through over the years, and this dating back to even before the Civil War, and then compounded by the Civil War, and then the introduction of the gangs, and that type of violence, by not addressing the actual root causes and then also not looking at the trauma and not having a complete reconciliation process at the end of the war, it kind of left the door open for this type of violence to take root, which they've been dealing with now. And now I think it's important that we also look at the fact that they have had the truce, and that in itself is a new dynamic that is continued to evolve, and it remains to be seen how well that's going to work. But up to this point, it's been, for the most part, I think pretty positive in terms of reducing the rates of homicides. There are many people who have questions about how it came about and where it's going, but I think at this point, it's generated quite a bit of excitement about the possibilities that could happen from dealing with homicides and dealing with kind of criminal elements and gangs in a different type of manner than previously had been dealt with. And I think they'd been viewed more as criminals, and it wasn't thought of that these are people that you can negotiate with, or these are people that you could talk to, and they were virtually left out of society. And now I think that people are starting to take another look at it and say, well, this is a part of our society, and we need to learn how to work with that in order to address violence.
Which vulnerabilities are identified in this scenario, and which sense these vulnerabilities legitimate the humanitarian action in urban contexts? And which are the main challenges in trying to implement these practices?
First off, I have to just clarify, I'm not a humanitarian per se, so a lot of what I'm talking about is based on what we've observed over the last year, and also from my own experience working in communities affected by violence in the United States, and from my experience working in post-conflict countries elsewhere, and kind of trying to apply that to the situation in El Salvador. It's interesting to see right now, because I think before, in terms of when you're talking about who was actually working on the situation of violence, and I'm going to address it really from looking at the idea of prevention, intervention, and reintegration. So it's kind of a specific angle that I think that humanitarians are starting to talk about now in terms of their involvement, and it's kind of a new frontier for them in that respect. The idea in El Salvador to do prevention and intervention type programs is I think as a result of the truce that's starting to gain a bit of support, but historically that wasn't the case. I think you're looking at a situation where the overwhelmingly the society and even the previous governments looked at the idea of social cleansing. And also in terms of the legal framework, they enacted a series of tougher laws, kind of get tough laws that they call them mano dura, that increased incarceration rates, made being a gang member illegal, made being associating with a gang member illegal, or not necessarily illegal, but very difficult. And that really had a detrimental effect on humanitarian actors and different actors as well, local community groups that were trying to work in settings where there was a lot of violence. And the violence itself had a great effect on that, in terms of how do people negotiate working in communities that, while in El Salvador, a lot of times were outside of the rule of law of El Salvador. And in some senses, the representatives of the state in these communities, in the form of the police or the military, weren't necessarily viewed as legitimate actors by the local communities themselves, or by parts of the communities. One of the things that struck me when we did our delegation visit and in conversations with people there, is the concern that not only did people not want to support the truce or any sort of peace process because they didn't trust the gangs, but many people voiced concerns about not trusting the police either. So in a humanitarian aspect, where do you stand in that where do you stand in relation to who you're working with and and also where you're getting your legitimacy from? So I think that's a real challenge that needs to be worked through. And also in terms of looking at I think for me a lot of it has to do with just the credibility of the organizations to be able to get the work done and the legitimacy they have in the communities. And I distinguish those two in terms of some of the smaller local community groups are able to operate in areas that a lot of times the traditional humanitarians haven't operated in before, and it's kind of a new area. So it's looking at how do you marry the humanitarian approach with some of the local level community organizations that are working there and work towards the agendas that they're facing in their own communities. And that's a difficulty I think that folks are going to have across the board. But what we do have in El Salvador as a result of the truce is that there is the opening of possibilities towards a different type of framework. And that's something I think people are watching very well. There's much more of a human face on the gangs themselves. People are now looking at the gangs as members, not necessarily everybody, but some people are starting to look at them as members of society, which wasn't necessarily the case before. There has been government involvement in the process. The Ministry of Justice has been a strong proponent of supporting the truce, as well as some members of the church. But there's also challenges in the fact that it hasn't been overwhelming. There hasn't been a direct show of support from the government or any direction in that regard, which is important for allowing other people other actors to get involved. So it's a dynamic situation. It's something to keep an eye on. So far, I think people, whether they agree with the truce or not, are enjoying the peace dividend from the process, and how that affects the humanitarian actors in this kind of new realm of prevention and intervention remains to be seen. But I think that El Salvador does provide kind of a window into how it might work in a situation where you could potentially have government, humanitarian, and local actors working together and addressing some of the kind of root causes of the violence itself, and not just addressing it from a violence as a criminal issue in society.
This was the HASOW series. To learn more about the project, visit hasow.org.